Good morning. I'm so thankful that you could join in and be part in our study here this morning as we're looking at our 40 days in prayer. This morning we're in Psalm 119 and we're going to look at verse 57 through 60 here. In verse 57 is Psalm 119. It says, "Thou art my portion, O Lord." How beautiful. I love that, and I'm trying not to stop here, but he realized that whenever he had the Lord, he had everything that he needs. I have said, I will keep thy words. Verse 58, I entreated thy favor with my whole heart. Be merciful unto me according to thy word. I thought on my ways, and turned my feet unto thy testimonies. I made haste, and delayed not to keep thy commandments. Remember, the psalmist is dealing with a difficult time in this section, whether it's a loss, whether it's something that has been stolen from him, or just a heartache and a difficulty. He's dealing with a difficult time here. And he fully had relied on the Lord. This first verse, thou art my portion. He recognized who his portion was. And right after he recognized this, he resolves in verse number 57, the second half there, I have said I will keep thy words. He's resolved that I'm going to keep God's word. And not only was he going to keep God's word, but then he requests in verse 58 God's favor. Entreat thy favor with thy whole heart. He wanted God's favor on his life and on the situation, and then he calls out for God's mercy. He claims God's mercy, or the promise of God's mercy, according to your word. Lord, you said you'd be merciful. I need you to show your mercy to me. Have you ever had times of prayer whenever you really realized you needed something from God? You got on your face, you got on your knees before him, and you've asked him and just said, God, I need guidance, I need help. I want you to notice what his direction, what he did in the middle of praying this. His thought process on this, in verse 59 through 60, we see that his direction towards God and entreating God's favor, it caused him to direct his way a certain way. His feet began to walk, if you will, a certain path. Look at verse 59. I thought on my ways and turned my feet unto thy testimonies. I like this. This verse is pretty simple. He chose to obey. I thought on my ways, and I turned my feet into thy testimony. There's four things we can pick up about obedience here. The first thing is I thought. He deliberated on. He thought on God's ways. He began to mull over and to think, begin to ruminate, if you will, or meditate on God's ways. The word amusement has to do with our musing, and the whole idea of amusement is to distract our musing from different things to different things and to occupy our musing, our thoughts. And I think about how often our thoughts for God and our thoughts towards spiritual things are drowned out because of the noise that goes on in our everyday lives. The psalmist here recognized in the middle of this heartaches that I'm going to think on my ways. Not only did he think, his thoughts had a direction. His thoughts had direction. Where is it that God's word, and where was his thoughts taking him? Well, his thoughts took him directly to God's ways, remembering what God has done, what God was trying to tell him, what God was trying to show him. So he thought, but he thought on the right ways, was the second part of the obedience. The third part, we see that, and I turned my feet. He got direction. I turned my feet. And I turned my feet. He got direction. He knew where he was headed. He knew the direction that he needed to go. Well, how did he know that? Because he thought on God's ways, and God's ways gave him directions. I turned my feet according to thy testimonies. He turned his feet according to the testimonies. There was a division, and I think about this idea. Think about this with me for just a second. If we are going to turn our feet towards a direction, if we're going to turn our feet towards his testimonies and follow God's word, that means that there's going to be other things that we're going to have to choose not to follow. There's going to be other directions we're going to have to turn and say, no, that is not a good way. That is not the right way. That's not the way that I need to go. And with this, I love this reminder of obedience began with not wanting to go necessarily his own way, but understanding and thinking on God's way and trusting God. And in verse 60, we see that obedience, that decision, that thought process being put right into action. We see how the obedience is put into action. I made haste and delayed not to keep thy commandments. Whenever he made a decision, he said, I'm going to do it. He made haste to be obedient. Procrastination, an old proverb, it says procrastination is the thief of time. Procrastination is the thief of time. So often we can procrastinate or think about other things. We think about what's going on, and we want to do things a little bit later or take care of things a little bit later. Whenever now is to take time to take care of what we need to. Now is the time to obey. Now is the time to deal with our issues. I was talking to an individual once who had been struggling in the area of pornography, and he wanted help. And I said, when do we want to meet and sit down and talk about how we can start taking steps to protect you? I have plenty of time right now. We can sit down and discuss and go through and start dealing with this issue. And the young man looked at me and he said, no, I think I want to get back with you and talk to you tomorrow or the next day. The man never ended up getting victory in this area in his life. And the reason he didn't get victory is because while God was speaking to him, while the opportunity to get things taken care of was at hand, he procrastinated. He didn't obey right away, but instead he delayed. We tell our kids all the time, delayed obedience is disobedience. So often someone will say, I'll follow God, I'll walk in his ways tomorrow. And there's disobedience. We procrastinate, thinking that it's going to be a burden, thinking it's going to be a burden to obey. It's going to be a burden to follow God's word. It's going to be a burden to spend time with him. That it's going to be a burden because we have so many other things that we would rather do. But all the while, God is wanting us to put aside our selfishness, our pride, our own way, and our own thoughts, because he wants to turn that burden into a blessing. The most amazing thing about obeying God is obedience always follows blessings. Let's not be fools. Let's respond in prompt obedience to God's word whenever he speaks. The psalmist here, he chose to obey without delay. We see his foes and his friends, and we're going to look at that a little bit tomorrow as we look at his foes and friends, and also his final decisions here of what to do in the middle of this heartache. I'm so thankful you could join in and be part of the 40 days in prayer. Do take time this morning to stop and to pray. Pray for our church. Pray that God will challenge hearts and change lives. Pray that God will sink in, that God's word will sink in and be applied to lives. Pray that we will choose as a church to obey God right away and without delay. I do ask that you'll pray for me. Pray for your pastor. Pray for my health. Pray for wisdom. Pray that God will give me boldness to proclaim his word clearly and distinctly. Pray that I can rejoice and see the victories. So often I only see the bad things, honestly. I see the tough things and I see the struggles. And I pray for those things, but help me to pray that God will help me to be able to see the victories as well. Thank you so much for tuning in and being part of the 40 Days in Prayer. I look forward to tonight's service, our service for this evening. We will be having a prayer service this evening in prayer for the revival that's right around the corner. Thank you once again for tuning in. God bless you. We'll see you tonight. If not, hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great day.